The year was 1875, and winter was already whispering its cold breath across the New Mexico territory. The wind, sharp with the promise of frost, swept grit across the high red plateau, carrying the thin, lonely cry of a distant coyote. It was a sound that matched the land itself, vast, stark, and touched with a wild, enduring sorrow. Below the rim of the mesa, nestled in a shallow bowl of land that offered little protection, sat a small, weathered homestead. The cabin was built of sturdy timber that had long since grayed, its chimney breathing a fragile plume of white smoke into the immense blue sky. A split rail fence, sagging in places, marked the boundary of a small pasture and a sheep pen. This was the farm of Evelyn Moore, and it was a lonely place. It sat on the very edge of what maps called civilization and what the Navajo called their ancestral home. The nearest town, a dusty collection of saloons, a general store, and a church, was a hard half-a-day's ride to the east. To the west, the land opened up into canyons and sacred mountains that belonged to a people who had been there long before the first maps were drawn. The air here was one of majestic isolation, a place where the wildness of the frontier was not a concept but a daily presence, and where freedom felt as raw and as dangerous as the landscape. Evelyn, or Evie as her parents had called her, was the sole occupant of this quiet outpost. She was the daughter of poor farmers, folk who had come west with dreams of soil and sky and had found only hardship. A plague had swept through the territory 2 years prior, taking both her mother and her father within a week, leaving Evie with nothing but this hard-packed piece of earth and the sturdy, empty cabin. She was 23 years old, in a town hungry for wives and mothers. She was an anomaly. She had never been courted, never known the touch of a man, not in affection and certainly not in passion. The townfolk, when they spoke of her at all, called her the eccentric spinster, or, more cruelly among the men at the bar, the lonely virgin of the canyon. She was a curiosity, a woman who did a man's work, kept her own counsel, and steadfastly refused to marry. Evie's goal was simple, yet it was the hardest goal a woman alone could have: to keep her land, to keep her freedom, and to keep her dignity. She would not be forced into a marriage for protection, nor would she sell the one thing her parents had died for, but the pressure was constant. The small society of the town did not know what to do with her. Whispers followed her when she rode in for supplies. It was not proper. The women said over their sewing, for a young woman to live so far out, all by herself. It was an invitation to trouble, to ruin. The trouble had a name: Samuel Briggs. Briggs was the wealthiest rancher in the county, a man whose ambition was as wide and relentless as the sky. His great herds of cattle were already overgrazing the public lands, and he wanted more. He wanted Evie's land, not for the meager grass it offered, but for the secret it held. A secret Evie's father had found just before he died: a strong, deep aquifer, a vein of living water that ran unseen beneath her dry pasture. In this land, water was not just life, it was power. It was gold. Briggs had made offers, all of them polite, all of them laced with steel. He sent his regards, he sent condolences for her loss, and he sent his foreman with papers to sign. When she refused, the town's pressure became heavier. The whispers became advice, then warnings. "You must marry, Miss Moore," the pastor had told her, his hands steepled. "Or sell your land and find proper work. The hotel needs a new waitress. A lone woman attracts the wrong kind of attention." The conflict was clear. Her choices were to be swallowed by marriage, to be erased by selling, or to be diminished by working in town, serving whiskey to the very men who gossiped about her. Evie had chosen none of them. She chose the hard, lonely freedom of the cabin. But she was not the only one fighting for this land. Farther west, in the heart of the Daintah, the Navajo land, a man named Tahan Yazi watched the sun rise. He was a man of perhaps 28 or 30 years, a warrior and a scout for his people. He moved with the silent grace of a hunter, his body lean and hard from a life lived outdoors. A long, pale scar cut across his left shoulder, a reminder of a fight he had not sought but had finished. His eyes, dark and deep, were wary, yet held a profound calm, the look of a man who understood the world as it was. not as he wished it to be. Tahan's goal was as clear as Evie's, to protect the land that gave his people life. His goal was to guard the sacred lands, the canyons that held the spirits of his ancestors, and most importantly, the water. The streams were being threatened by the endless tide of white settlement, by the hunters who killed the buffalo for sport, by the surveying crews for the railroad, and by the cattle, especially the cattle of Samuel Briggs. The conflict between the Navajo and the white settlers was an old wound, rubbed raw daily. Briggs, in his arrogance, let his cattle drift west onto Navajo grazing lands, letting them foul the sacred springs, turning clear water to mud. The Navajo were furious, their young men restless and eager for a fight. The cavalry, stationed at the fort a day's ride south, was meant to keep the peace, but Tahan knew they were there to protect white property, white interests. They offered tacit, and sometimes open, support to men like Briggs. The land itself was caught in the struggle, the pressures of men pushed on the natural world. The wolves, their hunting grounds shrinking and their usual prey decimated, were growing bolder, more desperate. They were hunted by ranchers and soldiers, and in their hunger, they became a shadow of the settlers' own aggression. Evie knew of the Navajo only from the stories in town, stories of savages, of raids and scalps. She knew of Tahan only as a shadow she sometimes saw on a distant ridge, a shape she associated with the dangers of the wilderness. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and blood, Evie was checking her small flock of sheep. They were restless, bleeding and huddling against the fence. Her old dog, Buster, let out a low growl, the fur on his neck standing up. Evie's eyes scanned the ridge that marked the western edge of her property. A figure was there, on horseback, sitting still, her heart hammered against her ribs. A horse thief, or worse. She ran back to the cabin, her skirts tangling in the brush, her hands, shaking slightly, grabbed the Winchester rifle from its pegs above the door. She checked the load, her movements practiced and sure, and stepped back outside, leveling the barrel on the porch rail. "Get off my land," she shouted, her voice sounding small in the vast expanse. The rider did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his horse. He was not a white man. He wore buckskin leggings and a dark shirt. His black hair was long, tied back with a simple band. He was a Navajo warrior. Evie's finger tightened on the trigger. All the stories, all the warnings, rushed into her mind. Then she saw them. To the north of the rider, just slipping through a break in the rocks, were two gray shapes, wolves. They were stalking her flock, using the ravine for cover, and the Navajo man was between them and her sheep. He raised his hand, not in greeting, but holding a bow. He had not been watching her. He had been watching the predators, as she watched, frozen. He nudged his horse forward, down the slope, away from her but toward the wolves. He let out a sharp cry, a sound that cut the air like a knife. The wolves stopped, turned, and after a moment of tense consideration, loped away into the growing shadows. The twist of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. The man she had been about to shoot, the savage she feared, had been protecting her property. He had been quietly, without her even knowing, chasing the wolves away from her livelihood. He turned his horse back toward her. He was still too far away to see his features clearly, but he was not the monster of her imagination. He was just a man. He sat on his horse, looking at her rifle still pointed at him. Their eyes met across the distance, a long, silent exchange. Evie felt a strange mix of fear, shame, and a powerful, unfamiliar curiosity. He did not look angry. He simply looked. Tahan Yazi, from his vantage point, saw a lone woman with a rifle, her face pale in the dusk. He saw the defiance in her stance, and perhaps he saw the fear. He gave a single, slight nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of peace or war, but simply of existence. Then he turned his horse and rode west, disappearing into the red shadows of the canyon. Evie lowered the rifle, her arms trembling. She had never seen a Navajo up close, not one who was not a prisoner in chains or a tamed servant in town. She had only heard the stories, the tales of blood and fire, but this man had protected her. She stood there for a long time, long after he was gone, watching the empty space where he had been. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the loneliness more acute. Evie lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind. The coyote calls sounded closer now, a chorus of hungry ghosts. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, but the chill she felt was deep inside her. She remembered her mother and father, their faces slick with the fever, their breathing ragged. She remembered the terror, the sour smell of sickness that clung to everything. She had been so afraid. When her mother had stopped breathing, she had not stayed. She had run. She had fled the cabin, fled the plague, fled the duty of sitting with her dying father. She had run all the way to the Briggs ranch, pounding on their door, begging for help, for the doctor. But they had not opened it. Mrs. Briggs had shouted through the thick wood, "You get away, you carry the plague, do not bring it here." She had spent 2 days huddled in her neighbor's barn, sick with fear and guilt, before returning to find her father cold in his bed. She had buried them herself. She had been a coward. She had abandoned them in their final hours. The wind howled, mimicking the sound of her own guilt. The town saw her as a lonely, stubborn spinster, but she knew the truth. She was a coward, and a coward did not deserve a good man's love. She did not deserve to be saved. She was meant to be alone. A week passed, and the first true storm of the season broke over the territory. It was not a gentle snow. It was a sudden, violent blizzard that arrived in the dead of night, an unseasonable fury of wind and ice. The wind shrieked like a living thing, rattling the cabin's single window and forcing fine powder snow through every tiny crack in the walls. Evie was in the small, cold barn, finishing her nightly chores. Her old mule and her 3 remaining sheep huddled together for warmth, their breath pluming in the lantern light. She had just finished latching the heavy bar on the barn door when she heard it. At first, it was a sound swallowed by the wind, a high-pitched scream that was almost human. She froze, her hand on the wooden bar. Then it came again, sharper this time. A horse in terrible distress. It was followed by a sound that made her blood turn to ice, the deep, guttural snarling of a wolf pack. And then, unmistakably, a man's cry of pain. The sounds were coming from the stand of pinyon pines just west of her pasture, on the edge of her property. Her first instinct, the one born of years of isolation, was to bolt the door, blow out the lantern, and hide. The world outside was not her problem. It was a world of teeth and cold, but the memory of her father's cold face, of her own cowardice, rose in her throat like bile. She would not be that person again. Not tonight. Her body moved before her mind could protest. She grabbed the lantern in one hand and her Winchester, which she always kept by the barn door, in the other. She unbarred the door and plunged into the white chaos. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and nearly extinguished the lantern. Snow blinded her, a swirling vortex of white and black. "Hello!" she screamed, her voice ripped away by the gale. "Who is there?" She heard the wolves, a chorus of snarls and yelps, punctuated by the terrible, frantic sound of a horse thrashing. She ran toward the noise, slipping and falling on the icy ground, the lantern swinging wildly, casting monstrous shadows. She broke through the line of trees and stopped. The scene before her was a nightmare. A horse, its dark coat covered in snow and blood, lay on its side, its legs kicking weakly. A large gray wolf was at its throat. 2 others were tearing at its flank, and just feet away, half buried in a snowdrift, was a man. It was Tahanyazi, the Navajo warrior. He was on his back, trying to push himself up with one arm, a long knife in his other hand. A massive wolf, the pack leader, was circling him, its teeth bared, as Evie watched, frozen in horror. The wolf lunged. Tahan twisted, but the beast's jaws clamped down on his thigh, shaking its head, tearing fabric and flesh. He cried out again, a sound of pure agony. That sound broke Evie's paralysis. She did not think, she acted. She raised the Winchester high and fired a shot into the black, swirling sky. The explosion cracked through the storm. The wolves flinched, startled. The leader released Tahan's leg and backed away, growling, its yellow eyes fixing on her new light. "Get back!" Evie screamed, her voice cracking with fear and rage. She chambered another round. "Get away from him!" She took a step forward, waving the lantern. The light and the noise were a new threat. She fired again, this time at the ground near the pack leader. Snow and dirt exploded. The wolves, hungry but cautious, scattered a few yards, undecided. It was enough. Tahan's horse gave a final, shuddering sigh and lay still. The wolves had their kill, but Tahan was still alive. "Can you walk?" she yelled at him over the wind. He tried to rise, pushing himself up on his elbow, but collapsed back into the snow, his head lolling. He was losing too much blood. Evie looked from the man to the wolves and back. The pack was watching, waiting. She had to get him away from the dead horse, which would hold their attention for only so long. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and plunged forward, holding the lantern high. "Go on!" she shrieked at the pack, and threw a nearby chunk of ice she grabbed from the ground. It struck one of the smaller wolves, which yelped. She reached Tahan's side. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. His eyes were half open but unfocused. "You must help me," she said, grabbing the front of his buckskin shirt. "Help me?" He groaned, a low sound. He was nearly unconscious. She realized he could not walk. She could not carry him. She looked around desperately. Her eyes fell on a large, flat piece of bark that the storm had ripped from a dead pine. It was a crude sled, but it would have to do. She dragged it over, the wolves growling as she moved, their eyes like burning embers in the lantern light. Rolling him onto the bark was a nightmare. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and wet leather. She had to get close, her arms around his chest, her face pressed against his shoulder, to leverage him onto the makeshift sled. His shirt was torn at the side, and she could feel the wet, sticky warmth of his blood even through her gloves. His skin, where it was exposed, was hot to the touch. A shudder ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the first time she had ever held a man this close. She could smell the snow, the scent of pine, and a foreign, musky scent that was uniquely his. His shirt was ripped open, exposing a hard, broad chest, the skin a warm brown against the white snow. A flash of heat rose to her cheeks, a deeply inappropriate feeling that she immediately crushed. This was not a man. He was a patient. He was a dying person. She got him onto the bark and grabbed the rope she used for firewood, tying it hastily around his chest to keep him on. Then she began to pull. It was the hardest work she had ever done. Every step was a battle against the snow, the wind, and the dead weight of the man she was towing. She slipped. She fell. She got up again, her lungs burning. Behind her, the wolves, having given up on the man, descended on the horse with savage joy. She dragged him across the pasture and into the barn, the mule snorting in alarm. But the barn was not safe. The door was wood, but the wolves were desperate. She had to get him inside the cabin. She pulled him the last 20 yards, up the 2 steps onto her porch and through the doorway, collapsing onto the floorboards, her body shaking with exhaustion. The wind slammed the door shut behind them with a crash. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind outside and her own ragged breathing. Then, a new sound joined it. A low, menacing scratch at the door. The wolves had followed. They could smell the blood. Evie scrambled to her feet and shoved the heavy iron bolt into place. She grabbed the fireplace poker and jammed it under the door handle as an extra brace. Only then did she turn back to the man she had dragged into her home. He lay on the rag rug, snow melting in pools around him, his dark hair matted with blood and ice. He was muttering, his voice low and thick. The words were not English, they were Navajo. Then his eyes fluttered open, finding her. "Water," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Then he lapsed back into unconsciousness. He was burning with fever. His wet clothes were freezing to him. Evie knew she had to get them off and had to see the wounds. Her hands trembled as she reached for the laces of his buckskin shirt. She felt like she was violating some profound taboo. She was an unmarried woman, alone, undressing a man, an Indian man at that. The town, the pastor, her own mother's memory. All screamed at her, but the man was dying. "Forgive me," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. She worked with quick, impersonal movements. She pulled the wet, bloody shirt off his shoulders, revealing the scar she had seen from a distance, and another, fresher gash on his ribs that was bleeding sluggishly. His leggings were a greater challenge. The wolf bite on his thigh had torn the leather, but it was impossible to remove the leggings without causing him more agony. She ran to her sewing basket, grabbed her sharpest shears, and returned to his side. Taking a deep breath, she cut the buckskin from his hip to his knee, exposing the wound. It was bad, a deep, ragged tear that showed the muscle beneath. The cold had slowed the bleeding, but now, in the warmth of the cabin, it was beginning to flow again. She ran to the stove, stoked the fire, and put a kettle on. She tore strips from one of her old petticoats, the cleanest linen she had. She grabbed the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. She knelt beside him. "This will hurt," she said, though she knew he likely could not hear her. She poured the raw alcohol onto the open wound on his leg and then his side. Tahan's body arched off the floor with a choked scream. His eyes flew open, wide and wild, but they did not see her. He yelled in Navajo, a string of harsh, desperate words, before falling back, unconscious. Evie's hands were shaking so hard she could barely tie the bandages. She cleaned the blood from his skin, her touch as gentle as she could make it. His skin was hot, feverish, but so smooth. She could feel the hard muscles of his chest and abdomen beneath her fingers. She was acutely aware of his body, of his maleness, in a way that was both terrifying and deeply compelling. She was saving his life, but she felt a warmth in her own core, a thrum of awareness that she had never experienced. She finished the bandaging, her face burning. She covered him with every blanket she owned, piling them high. She sat back on her heels, exhausted, and finally, truly, looked at him. He was younger than she had thought, his features strong and noble, even in delirium. As the night wore on, he began to talk, his voice a low, fevered rumble. He spoke of sacred ground, of water that gave life. He spoke of fire, of soldiers in blue coats dragging women and children from their homes. He cried out a name. "Pastin!" he shouted, his hand gripping the blanket. "My brother! They have killed the water! He died in the water!" Evie sat, her blood cold, listening to the fragments of his nightmare. He spoke of an oath, a promise to protect the land, to never let the water be taken. He was not just a random warrior. He was a guardian. The scratching at the door had not stopped. It grew more insistent. A heavy body slammed against the wood, making the cabin shudder. The wolves knew he was inside. They were mad with the scent of blood and the promise of an easy meal. Evie's brief sense of safety vanished. She was trapped in her cabin with a wounded man and a pack of hungry wolves determined to get in. She grabbed her rifle. She could not shoot them all, but she could not let them in. She went to the window, peering through a small crack in the frost. Yellow eyes stared back at her from the darkness. She pulled the rifle through the small shooting port her father had built into the wall, a common feature in these remote homes, and fired into the dark. A sharp yelp, and the eyes vanished, but they returned, at the door, at the window, their shadows passing back and forth. Evie knew she could not sleep. She rebuilt the fire until it was roaring, a blazing wall of light and heat. She sat in the one chair, her rifle across her lap, watching the door, and listening to the delirious whispers of the Navajo warrior and the hungry growls of the wolves. The lonely virgin was in a fight for her life, and his, armed with a rifle, a fireplace, and a will that was. She was discovering, far stronger than the town, or she had ever believed. The sun was a pale, welcome smear in the eastern sky when the howling finally receded. Evie, aching in every bone, went to the window. The wolves were gone, retreated to their dens with the coming of the light. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a pristine, terrible white. She turned to Tahan. He was still, his breathing shallow. The fever was worse. His skin was flushed, and the blankets were soaked with his sweat. She checked his wounds. The bandages were clean. The bleeding had stopped, but the flesh around the bite was red and swollen. He needed more than she could give. He needed a doctor, But she knew, with sickening certainty, what would happen if she rode to town. If she brought Dr. Miller back, the whole town would know. The cavalry would be here before sunset. They would see a wounded Navajo, an Indian rebel, and they would drag him to the fort. Or worse, hang him as a spy or a raider. And Briggs would use this. He would twist it, claim Evie was a traitor, that she was harboring savages. He would have the perfect excuse to run her off her land. She looked at Tahan's face, peaceful now in his deep, fevered sleep. He was the man who had protected her sheep. He was a man who had lost his brother protecting his home. He was a man, not a savage. Her decision was made in that quiet, cold dawn. It was a terrible risk, a gamble against the law, against her neighbors, against everything she had been taught. But it was the only choice her new, fragile courage would allow. She would hide him. She would heal him herself. Or she would watch him die here, in her home, as a man, not as a prisoner. She began to organize his few belongings, which she had dropped by the door. His knife, a small leather pouch, and a quiver of arrows. She needed to hide them. She opened the leather pouch. Inside was not ammunition or trinkets. It was a map, a crude, beautiful map, drawn on a treated piece of deerskin. It showed the canyons, the ridges, and the mesas. And it showed a line, drawn in charcoal, a line that started deep in the Navajo mountains, snaked under the high plateau, and ended, unmistakably, with a small circle, a symbol for a spring, right where her cabin stood. Evie's hand flew to her mouth. This was not just a map. It was a map of the aquifer, the one her father had found, the one Samuel Briggs was trying to steal. She stared at the drawing, the truth of her situation falling on her with the weight of the snowdrifts outside. This man, Tahan Yazzie, had not just been scouting. He had been protecting this water source, the very lifeblood of his people. She was not on the verge of the conflict. She was, quite literally, sitting on top of it. Her land, her water, was the sole thing that both Briggs and Tahan's tribe needed to survive. And she, the lonely virgin, was now caught, irrevocably, in the middle, for 3 days. Tahan was lost in the fever. Evie did not sleep. She sat by his cot, her rifle always within reach, and forced sips of willow bark tea and thin broth between his cracked lips. The cabin was a small, tense world, filled with the sounds of his delirious whispers and her own quiet, fearful movements. She kept the fire blazing, as much to ward off the memory of the wolves as the deep, penetrating cold. On the 4th morning, she woke from a fitful doze in her chair to find him watching her. His eyes were clear. The fever had broken. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavier than the blankets she had piled on him. He was a man, and he was an Indian, and he was in her bedroom. She was a white woman, alone, and she had hidden him. The air crackled with unspoken laws, all of them broken. "The wolves are gone," she said, her voice sounding strange and loud. She stood, smoothing her apron, her hands suddenly clumsy. "You have been here for 3 nights." Tahan Yazzie said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and the tightening of his jaw showed him the price of the movement. He fell back against the pillows, his body rigid with pain, and she saw a deep, burning frustration. "You must be still," she said, her tone more medical than she felt. "You were badly wounded, your leg and your side." He looked at the clean bandages, then back at her. "Why?" His voice was a low, rough rasp, but the single word was clear. Why? Why had she saved him? Why had she not let the wolves finish him, or turned him over to the soldiers? She did not have an answer that would make sense. "You were hurt," she said, as if that explained everything. "I am fetching you broth." The first days of his recovery were a trial of awkwardness. She cooked, she cleaned, she brought him food. She took the empty bowl away. Their dialogue was limited to the necessities. "Eat this. The fire needs wood. I must change the bandages." That was the worst of it. Twice a day. She had to unwrap the linen from his thigh and his ribs, clean the wounds with her father's whiskey, and reapply the poultice of herbs she had dried. Her hands, calloused from farm work, felt huge and clumsy on his skin. She tried to be a doctor, to see him as just flesh and bone, but her body was a traitor. She was acutely aware of the hard muscle under her fingers, the warmth of his skin, the dark hair that covered his chest. She kept her eyes fixed on the wounds, but she could feel the heat rising in her own face. He, too, was uncomfortable. He lay stiff and silent as she worked, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. She was a white woman. To his people, her people were the source of disease, of broken treaties, of death. To be so weak, so dependent, in the hands of one, was a profound humiliation. He did not want to be a burden. More than that, he did not want to bring his war to her door. He knew what a white woman faced for even speaking to a Navajo, let alone hiding one. As he healed, the silence began to fill with words. At first, he sat by the fire, wrapped in one of her father's old blankets, and simply watched the flames. Then, one evening, he began to speak. He did not speak of his own pain, but of his people's. He told her of the land his ancestors had farmed for 1,000 years, of the canyons that held their spirits. He spoke of the soldiers who had come, the long walk, the years of exile in a flat, barren land far to the east, a place that killed their children and their spirit. He told her how they had been allowed to return, only to find their best lands taken, their springs fenced off. "The newspapers call us raiders," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the fire. "When we hunt to feed our children, they call it stealing. When we defend our water, they call it war." Evie listened, her sewing idle in her lap. She was hearing, for the first time, the other side of the stories that men like Briggs told in the saloon. The Indian raids were not motiveless savagery. They were the desperate acts of a people being strangled. "My brother, Hasteen, he was not a raider," Tahan said, his voice growing tighter. "He was a farmer. He tried to stop the soldiers from breaking a dam, one that watered his corn. They shot him." He turned his dark eyes to her. "They shot him for trying to save his corn. The water was sacred. It was our life." The truth, Evie was learning, had many aspects, and the history she knew, the one written by the victors, was full of terrible omissions. His honesty, his vulnerability, unlocked her own. The cabin grew quiet. The only sound was the pop of the fire and the sigh of the wind outside. It was her turn. "My parents," she began, her voice small. "They died of the fever, 2 years ago, in this cabin." She told him everything, the smell of the sickness, the terror, the moment she had realized her mother was gone, and then, the worst of it. "I ran," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I left him. My father was still alive, and I ran. I ran to the Briggs Ranch, begging for help, for the doctor. They would not open the door. They were afraid of the fever. I hid in their barn, like a criminal. When I came back, 2 days later he was gone. He had died all alone." She had not cried about this to another living soul. Now, the tears slid hot down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands. "The town," she choked out. "They think I am stubborn. They do not know. I am a coward. I abandoned him." She waited for the judgment, the pity, the words of comfort that would ring hollow. Tahan was silent for a long time. He did not move, did not offer a hand. He simply sat, his presence a solid, steady thing in the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "You were afraid. Fear is a powerful spirit. It makes us do what we must to survive. But you did not run from the wolves." "Evelyn." She looked up, startled. He had used her name. "You did not run from me," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "You ran toward the danger. You are not the woman who ran from the fever." His words did not absolve her. They did not erase the past, but they reframed it. They offered her a different version of herself, a version she wanted to believe. She was not the coward in the barn. She was the woman with the rifle. In the snow, the air in the cabin shifted. The tension did not disappear, but it changed. The boundary between patient and nurse, between savage and settler, began to blur. A few days later, a fragile, hesitant warmth entered the cabin. Tahan was strong enough to sit at the table, and he was trying to carve a piece of wood with his knife, his wounded side making his movements stiff. Evie, emboldened, tried to pronounce the Navajo word he had used for water. "Tito," she ventured. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Two," he corrected. The sound of a sharp, guttural click she could not replicate. She tried again, her face screwing up in concentration, producing a sound like a surprised chicken. A small, surprised sound came from Tahan. It was a laugh, a quiet, rusty sound, as if he had not used it in a long time. But it was a laugh. Evie, startled, laughed too. "All right," she said, her cheeks warm. "Two, water. What about sheep?" "Dibe," he said. "Dibe," she repeated. And this one she got right. "Good," he said, and the small smile reached his eyes. "Now this." He pointed to her, then to himself, then to the door he still could not use. "Stubborn." "Ah," she said. "Yes, that is the word for me. Stubborn." They laughed together, a shared, simple moment that felt more intimate than her changing his bandages. The next day, as she handed him his bowl of stew, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting contact, skin on skin, a jolt, like lightning, shot up Evie's arm. She snatched her hand back, her heart hammering. Tahan froze, the bowl halfway to the table, his eyes wide. The air was suddenly thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the man and the woman they were. Both looked away, a silent, mutual acknowledgement of a line that had just become visible. The outside world shattered their fragile peace a week later. A wagon rattled into the yard. Evie's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window. It was Jenkins, from the general store, his wagon piled with supplies for the ranches out this way. "He is here," she hissed. "Jenkins, he delivers supplies." Tahan was on his feet in an instant, the pain from his leg forgotten. "Where?" "Here, the pantry. It is the only place." She shoved him toward the small, dark closet where she kept her flour and preserves. Pulling a heavy quilt from her bed, "Get in, do not make a sound." He slipped inside, and she threw the quilt over the door, hiding him, before running to open the cabin door, trying to look annoyed at the interruption. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, forcing her voice to be steady. "Miss Moore." Jenkins was a thin, weasel-like man, his eyes too close together. He tipped his hat, but his gaze was already past her, scanning the inside of her cabin. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell. Thought I would just check. See if you needed anything. Flour coffee?" "No, thank you. I am fine," Evie said, standing firm in the doorway. But his eyes were sharp. My, he said, pushing past her into the room. "It feels warm here. You've been keeping that fire high." "And what's this?" He pointed to the table. In her haste, she had left Tahan's bowl and spoon by the sink. 2 bowls. "I have had a bad cold," Evie stammered, her mind racing. "I have been eating a lot of soup and sleeping by the fire." Jenkins's thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "A bad cold. Is that so?" His eyes roamed the room. They landed on the floor, under her bed, where the toe of Tahan's moccasin was just visible. Evie's blood ran cold. Jenkins's gaze lifted back to hers, and it was full of a sly, greasy understanding. "Well, you take care of yourself, Miss Moore," he said, backing toward the door. "It is a dangerous time, lots of dangers out here, human and otherwise. Briggs was just saying he was worried about you." He left. Evie stood, shaking, as she heard his wagon rattle away. The pantry door opened, and Tahan emerged, his face a mask of cold fury. "He saw," Tahan said, his voice flat. "He saw the bowl. He saw my moccasin. He will tell Briggs." He strode, limping heavily, to the corner where she had hidden his bow and knife. He began checking them, his movements jerky. "I must leave. Now." "You are a fool," Evie cried, her own fear turning to anger. She ran and stood in front of the door, blocking his exit. "You cannot even walk straight. The snow is still deep, and the wolves—" "The wolves are not as dangerous as that man," Tahan shot back. "He will bring Briggs. Briggs will bring the soldiers. They will find me here, and what do you think they will do to you? This is my fight, not yours." And what am I supposed to do? She yelled, her control finally snapping. Let you walk out there to die, so can I be safe, so I can be alone again? It is better than being hanged as a traitor, he roared, grabbing her shoulders. They will destroy you for helping me. The force of his words, his touch, broke something in her. All the fear, all the guilt, all the loneliness of the past years boiled over. And you think I care? She screamed, shoving at his chest. Do you think I care what those hypocrites in town say about me? I will not. I cannot stand by and watch another person die because I was too afraid to help. I will not lose someone else because I abandoned them. She was sobbing, her fists beating uselessly against him. The words, her deepest, darkest secret, hung in the air between them. He stopped, his hands still on her shoulders, his anger gone, replaced by a stunned silence. He was not just a burden to her. He was her chance, her penance. He was. She realized, with a chill, the one thing she was not willing to let go of. He stared at her, truly seeing the terror and the desperate resolve in her eyes. He understood. This was not just about him. It was about her father. It was about the woman she was trying to be. Slowly, his hands loosened on her shoulders. He did not let go, but his grip softened, from anger to something else. Something that felt almost like an embrace. He stayed. A few days later, the air was still thick with unspoken things, but the dynamic had changed. He was stronger. He insisted on helping. Together, they went out to repair the section of fence the wolves had tested. As they worked, Tahan spoke. The pack is still hungry, he said, pointing to the tracks in the mud. See the large one, the leader, walks with a limp. Your shot. He showed her how to read the story in the snow, how to tell a lone scout from the full pack. He took a few green pine boughs and started a small, smoky fire near the sheep pen. This, he said, will keep them away. The smoke, they do not like it. It is better than a bullet. The wolf is not evil. Evelyn, he is just hungry. She watched him, the smoke stinging her eyes, and nodded. She was learning to see the world, the wolves, and the man beside her. Not as good or evil, but as they were, back in town, in the smoke-filled saloon. Jenkins was making his report. She is not alone, he whispered to Samuel Briggs, leaning over the table. Got a man in there, and I'm telling you, Briggs, I saw moccasins. It looked like Indian leaves to me. Samuel Briggs leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He took a long drink of his whiskey. He had been planning to simply squeeze Evie more off her land. But this was a gift. An Indian rebel, Briggs mused, his eyes gleaming. Hiding him in her bed. Is she well? Well, that changes everything. That makes our lonely virgin a traitor. And traitors lose everything. That night, the stars were sharp and cold in the black sky. 1,000,000 diamonds scattered on velvet. Evie and Tahan stood on the small porch, the silence comfortable between them for the first time. He pointed up. My ancestors, he said, his voice a low rumble in the dark. They say the first man and first woman placed the stars, but Coyote, the trickster, became impatient. He grabbed the bag of stars and threw them. That is why the sky is as it is. A map of our laws, but also touched by chaos. Evie looked up, her heart full. My mother used to tell me about the stars, she said, finding the Big Dipper. She said it was a cup, always pointing north. She said if you were ever lost, you could follow that star, and it would lead you home or to freedom. He looked at her, a long, quiet look in the starlight. Two people, from two worlds, divided by a history of blood and fear, stood sharing the same sky, each finding their own meaning, their own hope, in the same pattern of light. It was a moment of peace, profound and fragile, a quiet breath before the inevitable storm. The scrape of a wagon wheel in the yard a few days later was a sound of pure dread. Evie, who had been mending a shirt, dropped it as if it were on fire. She and Tahan locked eyes across the small room. His recovery had been slow, but he was on his feet, his limp less pronounced but still evident. He was not, she knew, ready to run. The barn, she whispered. The hayloft. Quickly. He did not argue. He grabbed his knife, the one possession he kept by his side, and moved with a silent, pained grace out the back door. Evie watched him disappear into the shadows of the barn, his dark hair the last thing she saw, before she turned to face the front door, smoothing her apron, her heart a cold stone in her stomach. It was Samuel Briggs. He was not on his usual magnificent bay, but in a smart buggy, and he was not alone. He was carrying a small crate. "Miss Moore," he boomed, his voice a false, hearty thing that set her teeth on edge. He stepped onto her porch before she had invited him. "I was in the area, checking my herds, and I thought, that poor woman must be running low on comforts." He held up the crate. It held a cone of sugar and a bag of coffee. "A small gift for our bravest resident." "That is kind of you, Mr. Briggs," Evie said, her voice tight. She did not move to let him in. "But you need not have." "Nonsense." He pushed the crate into her hands, forcing her to take it, and used the opportunity to step past her, into the cabin. His large, booted feet seemed to violate the small space, making it feel cramped and dirty. His eyes were not on her. They were everywhere. They scanned the clean cot, the 2 chairs at the table, the extra blanket folded on her chest. He was a man taking inventory. "You keep a neat home, Miss Moore," he said, his gaze lingering on the pantry, where Tahan had first hidden. "A lonely home, though, too lonely for a woman such as yourself." Evie clutched the crate. "I manage well enough." "I am sure you do." He walked to the window, looking out over her pasture, his gaze stopping at the barn. Evie's heart stopped with it. "Has Tahan been seen? The wolves have been bad this season, I hear," Briggs said, turning back to her. His eyes were small, like a pig's, but sharp. "I lost 3 heads myself last week. Nasty business." He walked to the door, and Evie nearly sagged with relief, but he stopped on the threshold, turning to look at her, his smile fixed and cold. "You should come to town on Sunday." "Evelyn," he said, using her first name, a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "The pastor is giving a special sermon. It would do the town good to see you, to know you are well. A young woman, living all alone out here, is an easy target. Wolves come in all shapes, you know. Some walk on 4 legs, and some walk on 2. The threat hung in the air, as clear as if he had drawn a gun. He was warning her. "I will think on it, Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You do that." He tipped his hat, his smile never reaching his eyes, and left. She waited until his buggy was a speck of dust on the horizon before she sat down, her legs shaking. Tahan emerged from the barn, his face dark. "He knows," Tahan said. "He suspects," Evie corrected, though her heart was not in it. "He does not know." "He knows enough." The dread of that visit settled on her. Part of her, the cowardly part she so despised, wanted to obey, to ride in, to show her face, to prove she was still the same lonely spinster, not a traitor. And so, against Tahan's quiet, worried objections, she left. Sunday morning, she put on her mother's best dress, a faded gray calico, and rode her mule into town. She had not been to church in almost a year. As she tied the mule to the hitching post, she felt the silence. It was not a welcoming quiet. It was the silence of a held breath. Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife, who used to always have a kind word for her, saw her and immediately crossed the street, her face averted. 2 ranchers, who had been talking by the feed store, stopped and simply stared, their expressions hard. She walked into the small, hot church and slid into a pew at the very back. Every head turned. The whispers were immediate, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a floor. She saw Jenkins, his weasel face full of smug self-importance. She saw Briggs, sitting in the front pew, the picture of piety. The pastor, a man whose children she had played with, climbed to the pulpit. He would not meet her eyes. "Today," he began, his voice booming in the small space, "we speak of corruption. We speak of the sanctity of our homes, our people, our blood. The good book is clear. What fellowship hath light with darkness? What communion hath a believer with an infidel?" It was not a sermon. It was an accusation. He spoke of unclean relationships, of tainted houses, of those who would bring the savage serpent into our Eden. With every word, Evie felt the stares, the judgment, pressing down on her like a physical weight. No one looked at her directly, but everyone was looking. She was in darkness. She was an infidel. She sat, her back straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run, but the shame, the fury, the isolation. It was a brand, burning into her skin. When the service finally ended, she walked out, her head held high, through the crowd that parted for her as if she carried the plague her parents had died from. She did not remember the ride home. She only remembered stumbling into the cabin, bolting the door, and sliding down its rough-hewn planks. The solid wood at her back the only thing holding her up. And then, the tears she had refused to shed in town, the tears she had held back for years. They came. She wept. She wept for her parents, for her loneliness, for the hatred of the town, for the injustice of it all. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Great. Ragged gasps that tore from her throat. The cabin was silent save for her grief. She had almost forgotten Tahan was there. He had been sitting by the fire, mending a piece of harness. But now he was still. He did not rush to her. He did not speak. He simply rose, his movements still stiff, and came to sit on the floor, not beside her, but a few feet away, his back against the wall, sharing her low place. He just sat, his presence a quiet, solid anchor in her storm of grief. She cried for a long time. When the sobs finally quieted into shudders, she felt him move. He did not touch her face or her hands. He simply sat closer, until his shoulder was a solid presence next to hers. "They hate me," she whispered, her voice raw. "They fear you," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "You are not following their rules. It makes them fear their own rules are not strong enough." She leaned her head, exhausted, against the wall, but the movement was small, and her exhaustion was great. Her head slipped, landing on his shoulder. It was a shocking, solid warmth. She froze, expecting him to pull away, expecting her to feel that same jolt of shame she had felt in the church. But he did not move. He remained perfectly still. A solid, breathing wall of warmth and safety. Slowly, tentatively, she let her weight rest against him. It was the first time in her life she had ever, truly, leaned on another person. "He," she said, her voice muffled. "The pastor, he used to eat at our table. He called my mother a saint." "Men change," Tahan said, "when they are in a pack, like wolves." She turned her head, looking up at him. His face was so close. The lines of it were stark and beautiful in the firelight. The scar on his cheek, the darkness of his eyes, the firm line of his mouth. He was looking down at her, not with pity, or with the lust she had always feared from men, but with a quiet, profound understanding. "I am sorry," he said, "that I brought this to your home." "You did not," she said, her voice fierce. "It was already here. You just made me see it." The air between them was so thin. It was barely there. He was the cause of her ruin, and he was the only person in the world who understood it. He raised his hand, slowly, as if not to startle her. He did not touch her cheek. He brushed a stray piece of hair back from her temple, his fingers rough, calloused, and impossibly gentle. Her breath caught. "Evelyn," he whispered. And then, with the same slow, deliberate care, he leaned in and touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of shared solitude. It was chapped lips and the taste of wood smoke and salt. It was a question and a statement and a comfort, all at once. It lasted only a moment, a brief, staggering connection. Then he pulled back, his eyes searching hers. She did not pull away. She did not slap him. She simply looked back at him, her heart hammering a new, terrifying, wonderful rhythm. And then she leaned in, just a fraction, and he met her. And this time the kiss was deeper, a long, slow exploration, a sharing of breath, a promise made in the shadow of the gallows. It was a fire, not a raging one, but a deep, glowing coal, a warmth that spread from her lips to her chest and down into her very core. When they finally broke apart, the world had shifted. The cabin was no longer her prison. It was their fortress. The next evening, he unrolled the deerskin map on the table. The time for secrets. he knew, was over. "This is why Briggs wants your land," he said, his finger tracing the charcoal line. "This is the water. My people have known of it for generations. It is a sacred spring, one that flows underground, feeding the land, even in the driest seasons." He pointed to the mountains on the map. "Here, this is our land, but Briggs and the railroad men are trying to dam our rivers up here, to steal the water for the cattle, for the steam engines. If they succeed," his face was grim, "my people will die. The corn will dry in the fields. The herds will perish. We will have nothing." "But," Evie said, her mind racing, "if this is the only other source—" "It is," he said. "This spring, on your land, it is the only thing that keeps the lower valley alive, but it is a two-edged knife." He looked at her, his eyes full of the weight of his knowledge. "If we were to stop this spring, to divert it back into our own lands before it reaches this valley." The blood drained from Evie's face. "The town," she whispered. "The other farms, the river they all use, it will dry up." "In a single season," Tahan confirmed. "They would be gone. This entire valley would be a desert." She sat down, the wooden chair scraping on the floor. "So I am standing. I am sitting on the one thing that both sides need to live, and the one thing both sides would use to kill the other." "You are," he said. "You are the center of the war, Evelyn, whether you wanted to be or not." She looked at the map, at the cabin, at him. This was bigger than her loneliness. This was about survival. For everyone. "What do we do?" she asked. "There is a man," Tahan said. "A soldier, a sergeant. I have seen him. He's not like the others. He does not have the yellow fever for gold, or the hatred in his eyes. He listens. He is at the fort." "You want to talk to the army?" Evie was horrified. "I want to talk to him," Tahan corrected. "If you could go, as a white woman, if you could ask to speak to Sergeant Davis, and tell him there is a way to make peace, a treaty, not for land, but for water, a sharing. If he would meet with my elders, he would arrest me," she said. "He might," Tahan admitted. "Or he might be the one man who is tired of the killing." It was a desperate, insane plan, but it was the only one they had. "I will do it," she said. Their new, fragile alliance was shattered 2 days later by the sound of hoofbeats. Not one rider, but many. Evie looked out the window. Her heart stopped. It was the cavalry, a patrol of 6 men, their blue uniforms sharp against the brown landscape, their rifles in their scabbards. "The loft," she hissed. "No, the grain store, under the loose boards." Tahan did not hesitate. He was gone, melting into the shadows of the barn. Evie walked out onto the porch, her hands visibly trembling, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. A young sergeant, his face clean-shaven and serious, dismounted. It was the man Tahan had described. "Sergeant Davis." "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Apologies for the intrusion. We're on patrol." "Sergeant," Evie said, nodding, praying her voice was steady. "We are looking for information, ma'am," he said, and he looked uncomfortable. "There was a killing, a railroad man, over by the new spur line. Killed. Scalped." "Scalped," Evie repeated, her stomach twisting. "Yes, ma'am." He pulled a piece of paper from his tunic. "We have reported rumors, you understand, of a war party in this area. We are looking for their leader." He unfolded the paper. It was a crude drawing, a wanted poster. It described a tall Navajo man, long hair, wearing a dark buckskin shirt, with a prominent scar on his left shoulder. It was Tahan. "Have you seen anyone like that, ma'am?" the sergeant asked, his eyes kind, but also sharp, observant. "We were told we heard rumors that someone might be hiding out in these hills." The lie was hot and bitter on her tongue. "No," she said. "No one. I have seen no one." The sergeant looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. His gaze drifted past her, to the cabin, to the barn. "You live out here all alone, Miss Moore. It is admirable, but it is dangerous. If you see or hear anything, you will let us know." "Of course, Sergeant," she whispered. He paused, one foot in his stirrup. "Strange thing," he said, almost to himself. The man was scalped, but the tracks around the body, they were from boot heels, worn down, just like a cowboy's. Not moccasins. He looked at her. a silent question in his eyes. "I would not know about such things." "Sergeant," Evie said. He nodded, his face unreadable. "No, ma'am, I suppose not. Good day." He mounted, and the patrol rode away. Evie stood there until they were gone, and then she ran. Her skirts hiked up. To the barn, she pulled back the boards. Tahan was there, his face a mask of stone. He had heard everything. That night, the argument she had been dreading finally came. He was packing his few things into a small bundle, his knife, the map, a small bag of corn she had given him. "You are leaving," she stated. It was not a question. "I must," he said, his back to her. "He described me. Evelyn. That poster. It was me." "It is a lie," she cried. "Briggs. It has to be Briggs. The boots. The sergeant saw the boots." "It does not matter if it is a lie," Tahan said, turning to her, his face full of a terrible, cold resolve. "It is the lie they will use. They will come back, not the sergeant, but the others, the ones who follow Briggs. They will come back, and they will find me, and they will hang you for helping me. So you will just run. You will leave me here to face them," she demanded, her fear making her cruel. "I will leave you here to be safe," he roared, his hands clenching. "What do you think will happen when they find me? Do you think they will listen to you? They will drag you into town, call you an Indian lover, and let the mob have you. I will not be the man who does that to you." "And you think I am so weak?" she shouted back, tears of pure rage stinging her eyes. "You think I am just a girl who needs protecting? After all this, I stood up to the wolves. I stood up in the town. I am not that person who ran from the fever anymore, and I will not let you be the one who makes me a coward again." He stared at her, stunned by her fury. "This is not about being a coward. Evelyn, this is about being smart. This is about living." "No," she said, stepping close to him, jabbing a finger at his chest. "This is about us. You think I'm afraid of them. I'm afraid of this, of you walking out that door and getting shot in the back, of me staying here, alone, forever, knowing I let you go. I love you, you fool." The words were out. They hung in the air, terrible and beautiful. His anger, his resolve, all of it crumbled. He reached out, his hand touching her cheek, his thumb tracing the path of a tear. "Do not," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Do not say that. It only makes it harder." "Good," she whispered back, leaning into his touch. "It should be hard. Staying alive should be hard. It means we are fighting." He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, clinging embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel him shaking. "They will kill us," he breathed into her neck. "Then they will kill us," she said, her arms around his waist, holding on as if she could hold him back from the world. "But they will not make us run." They stood like that for a long time, a tiny island of defiance in a world that wanted them dead. Later, long after the moon had risen, they stood on the porch, reconciled, their argument replaced by a grim, shared determination. They looked out over the valley. In the distance, they could see a dark mass, Briggs cattle, huddled together, and on the ridge, just beyond them, a few pairs of yellow eyes, glowing in the dark. The wolves, they were stalking the herd. "Soy Kongak," Tahan said, his voice quiet, his arms still around her waist. "They are just hungry." He looked toward the lights of the town, barely visible, and then toward the darkness of Briggs's ranch. "Man," he said, "when he is hungry for power, it is far more dangerous." A cold wind blew down from the mountains, and Evie shivered. A storm was coming. A much bigger storm. The summons arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the young son of the blacksmith. It was a folded piece of paper, heavy and official, inviting Miss Evelyn Moore to a town gathering at the church. The subject was listed as Peace Negotiations with the Navajo and Community Safety. It was signed by Samuel Briggs and endorsed by the pastor. Evie held the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. It felt less like an invitation and more like a warrant. "It is a trap," Tahan said. He was sharpening his knife by the fire, the scrape of stone on the steel the only sound in the cabin. He did not look up, but his shoulders were tense. "I know," Evie replied, tossing the paper onto the table. "But if I do not go, it is an admission of guilt. Briggs will say I'm afraid to face my neighbors because I have something to hide. You do have something to hide, Tahan pointed out, finally looking at her. Me. They do not know that for certain, she argued, though the confidence in her voice was brittle. If I go, and I stand tall, and I deny everything, perhaps the rumors will die. Briggs needs the town to support him to seize my land legally. He cannot just take it if the community is not on his side. Tahan stood and walked to the window, peering out at the gray, snow-choked pasture. I will go with you. No, Evie cried. That is exactly what he wants. If you are seen, I will not be seen, Tahan said, his voice calm and final. I will be in the shadows. I will be the wolf in the trees. If Briggs tries to harm you, he will find that the lonely virgin is not so unprotected. The ride to town was cold and silent. The sky was a flat, bruising purple, promising more snow. Evie rode her mule, her back straight, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt eyes on her from the moment she passed the town limits. The usually bustling street was quiet. People were already gathering at the church when she walked through the heavy oak doors. The heat of the room hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and fear. The entire town seemed to be there. Men stood along the back walls, arms crossed. Women sat in the pews, whispering behind their hands. In the front row, a detachment of cavalry soldiers sat stiffly, their blue uniforms bright against the drab wood. Samuel Briggs stood at the pulpit, where the pastor usually preached. He looked every inch the benevolent patriarch, dressed in a fine black suit, his face gravely. Miss Moore, Briggs boomed, his voice echoing in the hush. So good of you to join us. Please, take a seat. He gestured to a lone wooden chair placed in the center of the aisle, facing the pulpit. It looked like the seat of the accused in a courtroom. Evie walked forward, her chin lifted. She refused to sit. She stood behind the chair, gripping its back with gloved hands. I will stand. Mr. Briggs, what is this meeting regarding? Briggs sighed, a theatrical sound of heavy burdens. We are here to discuss the safety of our families. Evelyn, we've had reports, terrible reports. He signaled to Jenkins, who scurried forward from the side, holding a burlap sack. Jenkins upended the sack onto the communion table, a bloody arrow and a piece of torn. Dark buckskin fell out. A gasp rippled through the room. These were found, Briggs said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, near the site where the railroad man was murdered, and he paused for effect. Similar items were seen by reliable witnesses near the Moore homestead. That is a lie, Evie said, her voice ringing clear and loud. I found no such things on my land. Perhaps you did not find them, Briggs said smoothly. Perhaps they were brought there by a guest. He leaned over the pulpit, his eyes hard and predatory. We know he is there. Evelyn, the savage, the murderer. We know you are harboring him. The crowd erupted. Shouts of traitor and Indian lover flew from the back of the room. A woman Evie had known all her life stood up and pointed a shaking finger. My husband says you have been buying double rations. Who are you feeding? Evie Moore. Evie felt the room closing in on her. It was not a meeting. It was a lynching in the making. She looked at the pastor, begging for intervention. But the old man stared at his boots. She looked at the soldiers, but they sat impassive, waiting for orders. She had two choices. She could deny it and be called a liar, or she could tell the truth and be destroyed. But looking at Briggs, at his smug, triumphant face, something in Evie snapped. The fear that had ruled her life, the fear of the fever, of the wolves, of the town's judgment, suddenly burned away, replaced by a white-hot anger. She stepped away from the chair, into the open aisle. Yes, she said. The room went instantly silent. Yes, she repeated, her voice shaking not with fear, but with fury. I'm feeding someone. I'm feeding a man who was torn apart by wolves because he was protecting my sheep, protecting your borders. She turned to face the crowd, her eyes blazing. You call him a savage. He lay in his own blood to keep the pack away from my flock. While you, she spun back to Briggs, you tried to buy my land for pennies while my parents were barely cold in their graves. You call him a murderer. I have lived with him for weeks. He has treated me with more honor, more respect, in one day than any man in this town has shown me in my entire life. She admits it, Briggs shouted, pointing an accusing finger. She admits harboring the enemy. She has been corrupted. Seize her. Two rough-looking men, hands on their pistols, stepped forward from the front row. Do not touch her. The voice came from the open church doors. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that stopped the men in their tracks. Tahan Yazi stood in the doorway. He had left his weapons outside. He wore his mended buckskin shirt and leggings. He stood tall, his hands open and empty at his sides. He looked at the soldiers, then at the townspeople, and finally at Evie. I am Tahan Yazi, he said. I am the one you seek. Let the woman go. She has done no wrong but shows mercy to a dying man. Evie's heart broke. No, she whispered. Tahan, no. Briggs's face turned a shade of purple. He had wanted to drag Tahan out of a hole, to show him as a coward. Instead, the warrior had walked in like a king. Arrest him, Briggs screamed. He is the leader of the raiding party. He killed the railroad man. Hang him now before his tribe attacks. The mob mentality, stoked by Briggs's fear-mongering, caught fire. Hang him, someone shouted. String him up. The soldiers stood, but the mob was faster. Half a dozen men rushed Tahan. He did not fight. He let them grab him, let them rough him up. His eyes locked on Evie. They dragged him toward the center of the church, someone throwing a rope over the heavy timber beam above. Stop! Evie screamed, throwing herself at the men holding him. She clawed at their coats, but she was shoved aside, falling hard onto the floorboards. This is justice, Briggs yelled. Coming down from the pulpit, his face twisted with glee. This is what we do to those who threaten our progress. They pulled Tahan to his feet beneath the beam. The noose was roughly placed around his neck. He did not struggle. He looked at Briggs with calm contempt. You can kill me, Tahan said, his voice steady. But you cannot kill the truth. The water does not belong to you. Pull, Briggs commanded. Belay that order. The shout cracked through the air like a whip. It came from the front row. The young cavalry sergeant, Sergeant Davis, had stepped forward, his service revolver drawn. He pointed it not at Tahan, but at the ceiling, firing a single, deafening shot. The crowd froze. Cut him down, Sergeant Davis ordered, his voice cold steel. You have no authority here, Sergeant Briggs spluttered. This is a town matter. That man is a murderer. That man, Davis said, holstering his gun and pulling a folded piece of paper from his tunic, is a witness, and I have another. He gestured to the side door of the vestry. It opened, and an old Navajo man walked in. He was dressed in traditional blankets, his face a map of wrinkles, leaning on a staff. He was accompanied by a young private. A murmur of confusion ran through the crowd. This is Hastine Bigay, Sergeant Davis announced. He is an elder of Dine, and he has been sitting in my office at the fort since yesterday, negotiating a treaty for water rights. He confirms that Tahan Yazi was 50 miles away, at the healing ceremony for his sister, on the night the railroad man was killed. Davis turned his cold eyes on Briggs. And furthermore, Mr. Briggs, my scout, found the tracks at the murder scene. They were made with boots. Specifically, a boot with a cracked heel plate, a unique mark. The sergeant walked over to Jenkins, who was trying to inch away into the crowd. Lift your foot, son. Jenkins turned pale. He tried to run, but the soldier next to him grabbed his collar. They lifted his boot. The heel plate was cracked down the middle. Murder, Sergeant Davis said to the room. Done to incite a war, done to steal land. The silence in the church was absolute. The townspeople looked from Jenkins to Briggs, the realization dawning on them. They had been played. They had nearly hanged an innocent man. Briggs looked around, seeing his power evaporating. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the neighbors he had manipulated. He saw the ruin of his empire. Lies, Briggs screamed, his hand diving into his coat. It is a conspiracy. They are all savages. He pulled a Derringer pistol. He did not aim at the soldiers. He aimed at the one person who could ruin him completely. He aimed at Evie. Tahan moved. With the rope still loose around his neck, he lunged, shoving Evie to the floor just as the gun went off. The bullet bit into the wood of the pew where she had been standing. Fire! Briggs yelled to his hired hands. Chaos erupted. Briggs's 3 hired gunmen drew their weapons. The soldiers returned fire. The townspeople screamed, diving under pews, scrambling for the exits. The church filled with the deafening roar of gunshots and the acrid smoke of black powder. Tahan ripped the noose from his neck. He grabbed Evie, shielding her body with his own as glass shattered above them. "We must get out," he yelled over the din. They crawled toward the side door, bullets chewing up the floorboards around them. They burst out into the cold evening air, coughing. But the violence inside had summoned something else. From the surrounding woods, drawn by the smell of blood, the noise, and the frenzy, came the wolves. Not just 2 or 3, a massive pack, driven mad by the harsh winter and the scent of death. They poured into the town square, gray shadows moving with terrifying speed. Horses tethered at the rail screamed and reared, breaking their lines. A wolf leaped onto a fleeing gunman, tearing at his throat. Another dragged down a woman's skirts. It was the baker's wife before a soldier shot the beast. The fight had turned into a 4-way battle, the soldiers against Briggs's men. Everyone against the wolves, and the wolves against anything that moved. "Get to the wagon," Tahan yelled. He spotted a buckboard with spooked horses near the water trough. Briggs stumbled out of the church doors, clutching a bag of money he had seemingly grabbed from the vestry box. He saw Tahan and Evie. His face was a mask of insanity. He raised his pistol again. "You will not take it," he screamed. "It is mine! The water is mine!" He fired. The bullet struck Tahan in the shoulder, spinning him around. Tahan fell to the snow. "Tahan!" Evie shrieked. She scrambled in the snow, grabbing a dropped pistol from a fallen gunman. She raised it, aiming at Briggs with shaking hands. But she did not need to fire. Briggs's shout and the gunshot had drawn the attention of the pack leader, a massive, scarred timber wolf. It came from the side, a blur of gray and teeth. It hit Briggs with the force of a falling boulder. Briggs shrieked, a sound that cut through the gunfire as he went down under the weight of the beast. The bag of money burst open, gold coins scattering into the bloody snow, useless and cold. Other wolves joined the alpha. Briggs's screams were cut short. Nature had claimed its due. The man who had tried to consume the land was now being consumed by it. Inside the square, the sergeant and his men, along with Tahan, who had staggered back to his feet. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, formed a defensive line. They fired volley after volley into the pack. Evie stood beside Tahan, firing the heavy pistol until it clicked empty, defending the very people who had spat on her an hour ago. Finally, the sheer volume of fire drove the pack back, with their alpha gorging on Briggs. The rest of the wolves snatched what scraps they could and melted back into the dark tree line, leaving the town battered, bloody, and silent. The quiet that followed was heavy. The snow in the town square was churned into red slush. Groans of the wounded rose from the street. Evie dropped the empty pistol. She turned to Tahan. He was pale, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. But he was alive. He looked at her, his eyes fierce and burning with life. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. Heedless of the blood, heedless of the soldiers and the staring townspeople, he wrapped his good arm around her, holding her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. They stood there, 2 survivors in the wreckage of the world that had tried to destroy them. Around them, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. They looked at the dead body of Briggs, then at the gold coins scattered in the mud, and finally at the woman and the Navajo warrior holding each other in the center of the square. The sergeant walked over, his gun holstered. He looked at Tahan's wound, then at Briggs's corpse. He tipped his hat to Evie. "Justice," the sergeant said quietly, "has a strange way of working out. Miss Moore." Evie pulled back slightly to look at Tahan. "I'm fine," he whispered, though his voice was tight with pain. "It's just a scratch compared to the wolves." She laughed, a half sob, half hysterical sound. "We are alive." "We are," he said, and he kissed her forehead, a seal of possession and protection in front of God and everyone. "And the water is safe." The snow began to fall again, soft, white flakes covering the blood, covering the gold, covering the sins of the town. but it could not cover the truth that had been revealed. The lonely virgin and the warrior stood together, and for the first time, the town did not look at them with scorn. They looked with fear, and with a dawning, reluctant respect. The storm had broken, but the world had changed forever. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of surreal silence and numbed shock. The fresh falling snow was a mercy, a clean white blanket drawn over the blood and the scattered, useless gold. Briggs was dead. His body, along with those of his 2 gunmen and 3 of the townsfolk, was carried into the undertaker's small, grim building. The wolves, having gorged, were gone, leaving only their tracks. The town, in its stunned disbelief, gathered in the saloon, which had been turned into a makeshift hospital. Dr. Miller, his face grayer than usual, moved between the wounded, a half-dozen men and women who had been injured by stray bullets or the desperate, terrified horses. In the middle of it all, Evie tended to Tahan. She had torn strips from the pastor's altar cloth, a small sacrilege that no one dared to comment on, and was cleaning his shoulder wound. She did it right there in the church, in front of everyone. The time for hiding was over. The bullet had gone clean through the muscle, a painful but not a mortal wound. He sat on the edge of a pew, his face pale and set against the pain, watching her as she worked. His eyes saying everything his voice did not. The townspeople watched them too. They stood in small, quiet groups, their faces a mixture of shame, confusion, and a new, bewildering respect. The woman they had called a traitor had stood her ground, and the man they had called a savage had been the first to defend their children when the wolves attacked. Sergeant Davis, his duty done for the moment, stood by the door, a weary, satisfied look on his face. The question of what next hung heavy in the smoky air. Tahan was innocent of murder. Yes, but he was still a Navajo. Evie was innocent of being a traitor. Yes, but she had still taken him in. Nothing was simple. A heavy carriage, the official transport of the fort commander, rolled into town the next morning. A man with a gray mustache and silver eagles on his collar stepped out. Major Harrison, the man in charge, had come to see the mess for himself. He strode into the saloon, his gaze sweeping over the wounded, the shells shocked townspeople, and his own young sergeant. He had been a friend of Samuel Briggs. He had believed the man's reports. Now, he was faced with a very different story. He convened a meeting in that same saloon. The smell of whiskey and old blood thick in the air. "Sergeant Davis," he said, his voice a low bark. "Report." Sergeant Davis stood tall. He laid out the facts, his voice clear and unwavering. He spoke of the boot tracks, of Jenkins's confession the man had babbled the whole plot as soon as he was in irons, and of the testimony of the Navajo elder, Hastine Bigay. He spoke of Briggs's intent to start a war to seize the water rights, and of Evie Moore's bravery. When he was done, the major was silent for a long time. He looked at the townspeople. "Is this true, all of it?" The pastor stood up, his face ashen, his hands shaking. "It is, Major, to my everlasting shame. I helped him. I stoked the fear. I saw Miss Moore in this man, Tahan Yazi, defend our families with their own lives. We would be dead without them." Major Harrison's face was like granite. He had built his career on order. Briggs had created chaos. His duty and his anger shifted. "The warrant for Tahan Yazi is officially rescinded," the major declared. "The man is a hero, not a fugitive. And as for the matter of the water," he looked at Sergeant Davis, "get the elder, and get Tahan, and get Miss Moore. This dispute ends today." The negotiation took place at a long trestle table in the town's small courthouse. It was a strange, historic gathering. On one side sat Major Harrison and Sergeant Davis, representing the United States Army. On the other sat Hastine Bigay, the elder, and Tahan, his arm in a fresh sling. And in the middle, at the head of the table, sat Evelyn Moore. The town was represented by the pastor and the blacksmith, 2 men who now looked at Evie with open humility. The major was blunt. "The railroad needs water. The town needs water. The Navajo need water. Mr. Briggs is dead because he believed he could own it all. We are not going to make his mistake." Hastine Bigay spoke, his voice dry like the desert wind. Tahan translating. He spoke of the ancient compact, of how the water was a gift, not a property. He spoke of the broken dams and the stolen herds. The pastor, his voice thick with guilt, offered reparations, land from the church holdings, a share of the town's cattle. But Evie saw the impasse. It was still about his water and my water. She stood. The room went quiet. "The aquifer," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is on my land. My father found it. The map Tahan carried confirms it. It is the heart of the valley." The major looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Then you, Miss Moore, are now the wealthiest and most powerful person in this territory." "No," Evie said. "I am just the woman who lives there." She looked at the major, then at Hastine Begay. "I will not sell my land. Not to the railroad, not to the army, not to anyone." A muttering broke out. "But I will not keep the water," she continued, her voice rising above the noise. "My land and my farm will be a neutral zone. The water will be shared. A new well will be dug, managed by a council. One part for the town, one part for the Navajo, with a guarantee of safe passage to and from, and one part for the railroad, for which they will pay a fair price." "A price?" the major asked. "Yes," Evie said, her eyes flashing. "A price, to be paid into a joint fund, to be used to rebuild what was destroyed, to buy new herds for Tahan's people, to build a proper school in this town. The water is life. It should not be a reason for war. It should be the price of peace." She looked at every face at the table. "That is my condition. My land is not for sale, but the water is for everyone, or it is for no one." The room was silent. Hastine Begay looked at Tahan, and then at Evie, and a slow, deep smile spread across his ancient face. He nodded. "The woman speaks with the wisdom of the earth," he said. The major, a pragmatist, saw the brilliance of the solution. It avoided a war, it secured the railroad's needs, and it made him a peacemaker. He held out his hand to the elder. "We have a treaty, sir." The town had to face itself. That next Sunday, the pastor stood at his pulpit and delivered the bravest sermon of his life. He did not speak of infidels or serpents. He spoke of his own arrogance, his own sin of judgment. He publicly asked for Evelyn Moore's forgiveness. "We were so afraid of a savage in our midst," he said, his voice breaking, "that we did not see the true savage, the greed, that lived in our own hearts. We condemned a woman for her compassion, when it was that very compassion that saved us. May God, and may she, forgive us." The town was split. Some, like Jenkins' family, spat on the ground when Evie passed. They muttered about her, about the new treaty. Old hatreds died hard. But Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife, whose young son Tahan had pulled from the path of a stampeding horse, brought Evie a warm loaf of bread. The blacksmith offered to repair her fence, for free. The mothers of the town, who had seen their children protected by the two people they had despised, were the first to cross the divide. The social war was not over, but the ice had cracked. In the quiet days that followed, as the treaty was being signed at the fort, Tahan grew quiet. He was healing, his body mending, but his spirit was troubled. He found Evie by the stream, watching the cold, clear water run over the rocks. "It is done," she said, smiling at him. "The water is safe." "Yes," he said. He stood beside her, but not with her. There was a distance between them that had not been there during the fight. "I must leave. Evelyn," he said, his voice low. Her smile faltered. Her heart went cold. "Leave? What do you mean you are not a fugitive anymore? You are—" "I am a Navajo," he said, turning to her, his eyes full of a deep, agonizing pain. "And you are a white woman. This is your world. My presence here brought you only suffering. The fight is over, but the looks will not stop. The whispers. Every day. I am here. You will be the Indian lover. You will be an outcast. I cannot. I will not be the source of your pain." "My pain," she said, her voice rising, hurt and angry. "You think you are my pain. They are my pain. Briggs was my pain. My own cowardice was my pain. You are the one who stopped it. You think I am that weak, that I care what they call me." "I think," he said, "that I belong with my people. My duty is to them. I have been away too long. I am a warrior. I do not belong in a cabin, by a white woman's fire." He was pushing her away. He was using his duty as a shield to protect her, and to protect himself. from the new, terrifying vulnerability of his love. Evie felt the familiar sting of abandonment. He was leaving her, just like her parents had. The old wound throbbed. She could beg, she could plead, she could remind him of the kisses, of the battle, of the life they had saved together. But she saw the conflict in his eyes. He was torn between his old life and the new one he had never expected. Begging would only make him feel trapped. So, she did the hardest thing. She let go. "All right," she said, her voice quiet, but not defeated. "Go, then. Go back to your people. Go back to your duty." He looked at her. Stunned, he had expected tears, arguments. "But I will ask you one question first. Tahan Yazi," she said, stepping close to him, her eyes searching for him. "Not as a warrior, not as a Navajo, but as a man. Where do you want to be when the sun goes down?" She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Where is your peace? Is it on a mountain, listening to your sense of duty? Or is it here?" She did not wait for an answer. She turned and walked back to the cabin, her back straight, leaving him by the water, his internal war raging more fiercely than the battle in the town square. He did not come back to the cabin that night. Evie sat by the cold fire, her heart a leaden weight. She had lost. She had been brave, and she had fought, and she had still lost. At dawn, she heard a sound. She ran to the door, her heart leaping. He was there. He had not slept. He had not left. He was standing by the gate, his horse saddled, but he was not on it. He was just watching the sunrise paint her small cabin in shades of rose and gold. He walked toward her. He did not speak. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled something out. It was not a ring. It was a bracelet, hammered from silver, inlaid with a single blue piece of turquoise. "My people," he said, his voice rough, "have a story about the first man who was lonely, and he was given a wife, pulled from the earth, called Changing Woman. She was the water, she was the corn, she was the life." He took her hand. "You are not Changing Woman. Evelyn, you are Evelyn. You are the tree by the water, the one who did not break, the one who keeps the fire." He slipped the heavy, cold bracelet onto her wrist. It felt like a promise. I cannot be a white man," he said, his voice thick. "And you cannot be a Navajo woman. But I do not think it matters. My peace is not with the tribe. My peace is with you." He looked into her eyes, and the lonely virgin of the canyon, the girl who had believed she was too cowardly for love, saw herself reflected, not as a symbol, not as a landowner, but as a woman, chosen and cherished. "Will you?" he asked, his voice shaking for the first time. "Marry me, not just in your church, but in our way? Will you join your fire with mine?" She did not need to speak. She rose on her toes, her hands cupping his face, and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of salt and wood smoke, and a future that was as wild and as promising as the land itself. Their decision was, as expected, a shock to both communities. Some of Tahan's people, including his uncle, were worried. "She is a white woman," Hastine Bigay said, not unkindly. "Her people's promises are written on the wind." "She is not her people," Tahan replied. "She is her own." The town, too, was divided. The news that Miss Moore was marrying the Indian was the juiciest, most scandalous piece of gossip in a year. Some, like the pastor, offered their blessing with genuine warmth. Others, like the Jenkins family, saw it as the final proof of her betrayal. But they were a minority now. The bridge, fragile as it was, had been built. In the weeks that followed, they began to prepare. The cabin, her lonely fortress, was transformed. Tahan, with his good arm, helped her repair the porch. They patched the roof. They did not just shore it up against the world. They began to build a house. Evie planted flowers by the well, small, hardy purple blooms that could survive the cold. The war was over. The battle won. Now, the harder, quieter work of living began. The wolves still howled in the distance, a sound that would always be part of this land. But Evie no longer heard it as a threat. She heard it as a harmony, a wild note in the song of the life she had chosen. The day of their wedding arrived with the first true thaw of spring. It was a day of two ceremonies, a joining of two worlds under the same vast, pale blue sky. The morning belonged to the Navajo, Hastine Bigay, Tahan's uncle, conducted the ceremony. It was not held in a church, but in the open air, just east of the cabin, facing the rising sun. A small, clean fire was built, the smoke rising in a straight, pure column. Tahan's family had come, a quiet, dignified procession of people who looked at Evie not with scorn, but with a deep, searching curiosity. Evie wore her best dress, but she had also worn the turquoise bracelet Tahan had given her. She stood beside him, her hand in his. The elders spoke in the low, rhythmic tones of the Dine language, speaking of the sky as the father and the earth as the mother, and of the sacredness of a home built between them. They walked around the fire, their path blessed with cornmeal. They drank water from the same ladle, a symbol of the life they would now share. Tahan looked at her, his eyes dark and full of a love so profound it was almost painful to see. The afternoon belonged to the town. The pastor, his face etched with a new, true humility, arrived in his buggy. He brought with him a small, brave contingent from the town Sergeant Davis, his blue uniform pressed, Dr. Miller and his wife, who carried a freshly baked pie, the blacksmith and his family. They gathered on the newly repaired porch. Tahan wore his buckskins, a sign of respect for his own people. Evie stood beside him, a woman of two worlds. The pastor opened his Bible, but his sermon was short, and he did not speak of heathens or sin. He spoke of grace. "We stand here," he said, his voice thick, "at a home built by courage. We are witness not to the joining of two people, but to the mending of a world." He looked at Evie, his eyes full. "Evelyn Moore Yazzie and Tahan Yazzie, what God has seen fit to join, let no man, no law, and no prejudice put asunder." When he said the name, Evelyn Moore Yazzie, a quiet shock went through the small crowd. She was not just Evie. She was not just Mrs. Yazzie. She had kept her parents' name, and she had taken his. She had refused to be erased. She had chosen. The town, which had spent so long trying to define her by her loneliness or her supposed sin, had lost its power. She was no longer the lonely virgin. She was the woman who had built the bridge. In the months and years that followed, the cabin on the aquifer became the bridge the pastor had spoken of. It was no longer a fortress of isolation, but a crossroads. The new well, dug with money from the railroad fund and labor from both the town and the Navajo, became a place of commerce and peace. Navajo families, traveling to trade, would stop at the well, watering their horses and leaving gifts of dried meat or intricately woven blankets on Evie's porch. Evie, in turn, would trade them flour, sugar, and news. The ranchers and townsfolk, their fear replaced by a grudging reliance, also came. They stopped for water, or to buy Evie's wool, or sometimes, to ask for help. "Mr. Yazzie," the blacksmith said one afternoon, his hat in his hands. "My boy. He wandered off. 3 hours ago. We cannot find his trail." Tahan, who had been mending a harness, simply nodded. He picked up his bow, looked at the sky, and set off at a steady pace, the blacksmith running to keep up. He found the boy an hour later, asleep in a shallow ravine, unharmed. The cabin was no longer lonely. It was the busiest, safest place in the entire valley. One night, 2 years after their wedding, Evie and Tahan stood on the porch. The cabin was quiet. The day's trading was done. The air was cool and smelled of pine. They were not alone. A small boy, about 5 years old, sat on the steps, his black hair shining in the moonlight. His name was Yiska, and he was the son of Tahan's cousin, a boy orphaned by the same raid that had killed Hastin, Tahan's brother. He had been a wild, silent child, full of grief. Now, he was slowly learning to trust. A little girl, slightly older, with pale red hair, sat beside him, her head leaning on his shoulder. Her name was Ruth. She was a survivor of a wagon train, found wandering and mute by Sergeant Davis, who had brought her to the only place he knew that was a true sanctuary. Evie and Tahan were building a family not from blood, but from the fragments of the world that had broken around them. They were choosing not to be lonely, and they were choosing to offer that same solace to others. Tahan taught Yiska how to read the stars and how to track a rabbit. Evie taught Ruth how to read from the Bible and how to bake bread. Tahan taught Ruth how to ride a horse without fear. And Evie taught Yiska how to sign his new name, Yiska Yazzie. "Look," Tahan said quietly, pointing to the ridge. A dark mass of shapes moved against the rising moon. A herd of wild horses, their manes flying, ran across the high ground. They were beautiful, free, and strong. "My people's horses," Tahan murmured, pulling Evie closer, as if summoned. A long, mournful sound rose from the canyons. A wolf's howl. Yiska tensed, his small hand gripping the porch rail. Ruth whimpered and hid her face against the boy's shoulder. But Evie did not flinch. She had lived with that sound for too long. Tahan put a hand on each child's head. "Do not fear," Tahan said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "The wolf is just singing a song. He is full tonight. Our sheep are safe. The horses are free. The land is in balance." The herd, undisturbed by the sound, ran on, disappearing over the horizon. The children, comforted by his strength, relaxed. The land, which had once been a source of terror, was now just their home. Later that night, after the children were asleep in their small attic beds, Evie and Tahan sat on the porch swing he had built, a concession to her white comforts. The night was quiet, the stars a brilliant, cold spray across the black sky. Evie leaned her head on his shoulder, his strength a familiar, solid comfort. She was so tired, but it was a good tiredness, the tiredness of a full life, not of a lonely battle. He was quiet for a long time, his hand stroking her hair. "That night," he said, his voice so low she almost did not hear it. "The night of the wolves, when I lay in the snow, I thought it was my end. I thought I would die alone. I was not afraid of the teeth. I was afraid of the silence." He shifted, his arm tightening around her. "But then," he whispered, "I saw a light, your lantern, and I heard your voice. And when you brought me inside, I thought I was dying, but I could feel a fire, the fire in your hearth, I thought. That is a strong fire." It called to me. It pulled me back. He turned his head, his face close to hers, his breath warm. "I thought it was the wood, Evelyn, but it was you. You were the fire." She raised her face to his, and her heart was so full. She thought it might break from the sheer weight of her love. "It was a very lonely fire," she whispered. "It was waiting for you." He kissed her. It was not the chaste, desperate kiss of their first days. It was not the frantic kiss of the battle. It was a deep, slow kiss of possession, of knowledge, of absolute belonging. It was a kiss that promised the rest of their lives. He lifted her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her inside the cabin. She pulled the curtain across the window. The light from the oil lamp glowed for a moment, illuminating their shadows. And then it went out. The town, too, was healing. The pastor, true to his word, used his pulpit to preach a new gospel, one of grace and courage. He often spoke of the family at the well, of Tahan and Evie, as an example of how God worked in mysterious, challenging ways. The old prejudices did not vanish overnight. The Jenkins family still muttered in the saloon. Some ranchers still looked at Tahan with suspicion, but the world had changed. The children of the town, the ones who had seen the battle, did not see a savage. They saw Mr. Yazzie, the man who had faced down the wolves. They saw the man who could track a lost boy when no one else could. And they grew up seeing Navajo children and white children playing by the well, sharing a stick of candy. The old hatred began to look, to them, like a foolish, ancient story. The long winter was finally, truly, over. Spring came again, this time with a life-giving rain that seemed to wash the last of the blood from the land. The snow on the high peaks melted, and the aquifer, the source of all the conflict, ran deep and full. The new well flowed, clear and cold. The purple flowers Evie had planted by the cabin door burst into a riot of color. One afternoon, Evie stood by that well, her hand resting on the new wood. She was not alone. She held a small, blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms. A child. Her child. Born just 2 weeks prior. Tahan came up behind her. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her, his large, warm hands covering hers, encompassing her and the new life they had made together. They stood, the three of them, and looked out. They looked at the greening pasture, at the healthy sheep, at the smoke from the town in the east. and the shadows of the sacred mountains in the west. They stood at the center of the world they had built. The winter had been long, and it had been cold. It had taken almost everything, but winter always ends. And the West, with all its wildness and all its wounds, had never belonged to the men who came to conquer it. It had always belonged to those who had the courage to plant a seed, to build a home, and to dare to love in freedom. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so curious. Where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. It is always amazing to see where these tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And if you really want to help, hitting that hype button lets more people find this story and share in the experience. Your support means the world.